Okay, the first question maybe is an easy one, and it's a question to each panelist of you, and we are rather asking for your personal view. What do you consider the main achievement of global water research during the last, let's say, 5-6 years? For you personally, what has been gained mostly? And how should we start? Just go through the line.
One thing, the rules of engagement. If you don't want to respond for one reason or other, you just say elegantly pass, and then we go to the next one. And the way how we, and that's my profession, the way how we select the first speaker is totally random. So that will be stochastic. I have to, do that.
Okay. Well, I asked the question. Let's just start with Mr. Foster.
That was the random selection. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's been a great pleasure to be here and to try and keep up with the vast, very broad agenda that we've been confronted with. I'd just like, before I try to answer that question, to András used a certain amount of poetic license in introducing me, as he would, and he's a considerable poet. I would like to be a bit more specific in the perspectives with which I try to answer your question. My background probably is three. One, that I'm here having spent the last 18 months, 2 years in a small way, being one of 15 or 16 people trying to help the GWP in broadening the context of IWRM into the nexus, the various nexuses have been talked about and so elegantly expressed here. But I was a scientist at some stage, and possibly one of the groundwater grandfathers now. My colleagues in the groundwater field probably think that I stopped doing any science about 15 years ago, and they're probably right. But thirdly, and I think very importantly, and this is very much the sort of the way I've reacted to listening to this, the presentations here, comes from my 10 years of experience with the World Bank, where really I wasn't quite doing what András said. We were trying to implement, I suppose, IWRM at project level down in water-stressed areas in major cities, with high groundwater dependency, and in highly stressed agricultural areas with major groundwater use. And so it was very much looking at the operationalization of IWRM that has been my formative experience in the last years, and the way I set through all the sessions here. So this is my take on this agenda. And I would say that between those three, that I think that the global community have certainly moved the agenda forward and raised a political consciousness or consciousness about water resources, a global constraint or a very widespread constraint globally, at the international level. In the GWP, for example, we've seen the debate becoming broader, looking at the linkages more and things in that area. So it's informed that area very well. And hopefully, I can come to some omissions that I feel are there later and things that could be done in the future, but I think that relationship is good and the communication is reasonably good. But when I look at what actually influences decision-making down at the local level, operationalization of, it's an American word, not an English word, that's why I'm struggling, IWRM, the drivers, water security, water scarcity is an opportunity, a business opportunity, and very, very rapidly we establish vested interests around the status quo of sort of illogical service provision, for example. And this area, the communication at that area of influencing the general local political climate has not yet been achieved. And I think this is perhaps one of the most important areas to talk about.
Okay. First of all, before I start anything, I would like to really congratulate GWSP for achieving this much to bring us into the very comprehensive path of understanding water issues. in the world. As a person, I'm not related to water until 4 years ago when I engaged in this bidding committee for the 7th World Water Forum in Korea, which was successful. I cannot really go into what is the very specific item in relation to water resource or governance, but let me start with this story. Last week, in Korean major daily newspaper, there's an article, pretty big size. In the early morning, 72-year-old woman is walking the central kind of park in Seoul, the capital city, with his son, about 40 years old. So they are having good, strolling in the early morning walk. But suddenly, a big dog pop up and bitten her leg, bite. So this son of this lady, because it's cloudy probably, he was carrying umbrella. So he hit the dog with umbrella. Then the next thing happened was the owner of the dog came to hit him very hard way. So that was the message of this article. But, okay, this lady, 72-year-old lady, happens to be the wife of very wealthy conglomerates, which owns 16 companies' wife. And this owner of the dog happens to be diplomat officer in German embassy in Seoul. Okay, the reason I'm bringing this up is, in this conference, we've been told that all the water issues, governance, and all the shortage and everything, we should deal in very interdisciplinary way, multifaceted way. So what I'm trying to say in that article, there are a lot of dimension going on. It's between Korea and German, people, incident between. So different culture and different social status are through that strata because of this very wealthy lady of well-known companies, president wife, and this diplomat who's having extraterritorial right. So I think this, interdisciplinary and multifaceted way of solving these, problems is not easy. So this morning we mentioned that the meaning of climate science and hydrology, they don't even share the same meaning of science. So I learned a lot by attending this conference, and I do congratulate for you've done for GWSP. But we have to really, by putting together, try to analyze in detail one by one, we can reach some station, but I don't think it will be easy. Okay, here's a very simple arithmetic. During the 20th century, the population on Earth has been, tripled from 2 billion to 6 billion in 1999. Then water use, FAO says, water use has been 6 times increased. So compared to population increase, water consumption rate double. So we are aware that in 2050, there will be 9.3 billion people. And there will be 70% more of food is necessary. According to that, 70% in food production, we all know that 50% of water increase. So in this kind of simple arithmetic, it just comes to mind, we need time to solve things to make the public aware. But once in a while I wonder, in 1992, when we have Rio conference, it's already 20 years ago, why all our senior water experts is not engaged in water issue to be prominent at that time. They talked about energy through UNFCCC, and CBD has been, hosted, not water at the time. So we all know in Rio Plus 20 last year, water became really highlighted. So what I'm trying to say, 2012, 13 we are living in, 13 years has been passed in 21st century. We are, all of us who are in this room should be aware that we shouldn't make that kind of mistake that our senior water experts made mistake 20 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm also not a water person. I'm more a forestry person, if I'm still a forestry person. But I have been following what the water community has done in research. And personally, I think there are three interesting movements in the water research arena. One, I think you just mentioned, there is this movement towards more integrating different sciences to really respond to water challenges. The recognition that water researchers alone cannot really address all the major challenges and the type of knowledge we need for integrated water management, and therefore bringing other sciences. And by doing so, also contributing to other sciences. The last session we had, and when we were talking about the loss of biodiversity in rivers, in lakes, and so on, I think this is a great contribution also from water scientists to other sciences, and I think that's a very interesting movement. Finally, it's the issue of governance. I have seen quite a lot of interesting research being done trying to reflect how water governance is impacting the kinds of policies we need for management, the correct management of our water resources. I don't think we are there fully. I think it's a growing field, but it's a field that I feel that the water community is already tackling and should do so more. And it's also a field where the interdisciplinarity, the transdisciplinarity approach should be applied, because by discussing governance, you are also bringing different kinds of sciences to the water community. So again, I think this conference, unfortunately, I couldn't be here before, but from this morning and from the program, it's really, I should congratulate you and to say that water is very much in the agenda. This is the International Year for Water Cooperation, and I think the water community and the water research community as not only an opportunity, but I think a responsibility to really use all the opportunities during this year and in the future to spread the knowledge that has accumulated, and also to try to understand better what is needed from the research community.
Thank you. I also have to begin with a disclaimer that I'm not a water specialist. Even I'm a humble bureaucrat who follows orders. So I think I just would make myself a fool before this audience if I talked about the achievements of natural sciences in the past 20 years in the field of water. But I try to be constructive, so I'd rather say a few words about what we're missing from this political or policy decision-making part. And just very much could sign up to what has just been said, that the social, political, and economic linkages, I think, still need to be developed. Sometimes it's just a word of rephrasing, or it's a method of rephrasing existing things that can help. Just to give you an example, recently people start to talk about rivers as natural infrastructure. So once you have the word infrastructure, I think it catches the word or the attention of politicians, of business people, etc. So maybe sometimes with an innovative rephrasing of an existing problem or phenomenon, you can actually gain a lot of attention, and maybe you can change the course of the discussion. But also, if you have this kind of innovative approaches, and we can bring in the sort of business thinking and the political science, which should highlight how political decisions are made, I think that would be a major breakthrough in the field of water. And I'm sure this question will come up later, so I may elaborate on that a bit after. Thank you.
Yeah, I hoped I would have had an easy answer to your question if I had been at the conference. Unfortunately, I was just able to step in after the last lecture. So I think one of the very central achievements of research, I think, during the last years is that the theme of water has been brought so prominently on the table. I think this we should not forget. And then simultaneously take itself a bit out of the center. I remember with great joy and enthusiasm the recent conference, I think about 2 years ago, on the nexus of water, food and energy here, which put the theme of water in the context. And I think this is one of the things where we should go on to back away from the disciplinary thinking or from the sectorial thinking to put the humans in the center. Might speak about human security. Many people don't like this for certain reasons, but you may also speak about human well-being, I think, to put it in the context. One of the very good developments from my more narrow field of work, I think, has been great progress in the treatment of water not as a resource but as a danger, namely the theme of flooding, the theme of environmental risks coming from water. There has been great achievements not only from the side of research itself but also from the side of observation systems and so on, which goes very much into institutional developments. I would like to let it be with this at the moment.
I think linking up with what was said before, the most important achievement for me is that we started in the last years to get out of the water box and to make sure that we understand water not simply as a sector. Water is much more. This is not yet a common understanding very broadly. If you go in UN texts, you still find the water sector there. This is, I think, a major achievement. The second thing is that a lot of achievements in water research are very fragmented and are very much related to technology development. I think this is something we have to recognize, and we have to see how we are able to conceptualize these achievements with the overall issues. This means for me that this has to relate to governance, for example. The third point for me is to be not only a kind of lobbying for the big achievements. I think there are still a lot of gaps we have, and I think that water research and science has to recognize that the solutions we are today talking about had not been primarily driven by science. They had primarily driven by the problems people are facing on the ground in regions, in river basins. So this is something I think we should also see a bit self-critical, that water research has not been the major driver to make changes on the ground possible. And my fourth point is that Sometimes I have the feeling that in water research the most important issue is to find magic words for ordinary things. And I think this is something where my impression is, like we know from economics, that there is a kind of intellectual contractive cycle working in research, that you always start after a certain time with new magic words and try to put old wine in new pipes. And I think this is something we should be really a bit more critical than applauding each other about that. And last but not least, I think, and I know that this is probably a kind of water in a glass of wine. One important achievement for me in water research is that IWRM is not a concept where we can work on the ground and operationalize it in a certain governance structure which is only water sector driven and oriented. Also, this is for me a clear achievement and a clear endeavor of water research in the last 10 years.
Well, thank you so much for these contributions. I think the summary is that one of the big contributions was that we started to think out of the box. Gave way to interdisciplinarity in water research. Indeed, over the past 25 years, there has been an incredible progress in our data collection capabilities, satellite hydrology, remote sensing, our modeling capabilities because of the immense computer power we had, computational power we have had available in the meantime. But that went so far that we started to believe in our own models, and that is a little bit risky. You know, the science community started to cry like 15 years ago that one of the biggest issues of the 21st century is going to be water, and the politicians should listen to that. Water should be elevated on the national agendas or regional or even international agendas. So I think the science community was quite powerful and successful in that regard, that the politicians have listened to that. And now water is all over the place in the United Nations or the SDG discussions and everywhere. So the politicians were saying, fine, we hear you scientists, and then push the ball back, but give us the solutions. Not really specifying what those solutions could be. So I would like to have the next round around. What is it what you, policymakers, would need from the science community, from this science community? What is it that would help your policy-making process and the political processes? Can I start with you, Fritz?
I think one of the most important issues we have to deal with is that we know a lot about the central drivers of change in the field of water. What we forgot and where we have still a lot of gaps is how are we able to deal with the unintended consequences of our responses to the major drivers. I put it in an example. It was also on one of the slides. If we only focus on CO2 and are not looking left and right, we are going to produce bioenergy all over the world. You can travel with your car through North Rhine-Westphalia. You see the increasing mice production here. If you're going to Malaysia and you're landing on the airport of Kuala Lumpur, the last 15 kilometers, the only thing what you are going to see is palm oil production. And this CO2 focus ignored totally the issue of land use change, the issue of water, and also the more social and economic issues if it comes to the rural development in these areas and the change of rural development. So what I would like to ask for is the major drivers are clear, but don't lead politics that there is a single answer or a single measure to solve it. You have to see what are the unintended consequences we have to face if we go such a line. And this would be, from my point of view, the most important thing what I would like to see. And my second point is we know enough that we are able to act. This should be also recognized in the scientific community. And this permanent debate about uncertainties, about information and data gaps, this is a very interesting intellectual debate. But this is, from my point of view, not what politics need, that we are able to get them in the driving seat, to change the water issue, and especially the issues interlinked with water on the ground. I think this is something. This morning I thought, what would my minister have said if he would have sat in the auditorium after that? I think he would have found it very interesting. And the only thing, okay, then we need a new budget for gaining more data, and then it's done. And I think this is too comfortable for politics, that we say there are data gaps, there are information gaps, there are uncertainties. Okay, politicians lean back and say, we do nothing until the gaps are closed. Therefore, this should be also part of the debate in the scientific community.
Hold your fire, Jakob, because I would like to turn to the audience. This is a critical issue. I mean, what Fritz has said is a very serious message. What we have to listen to is that, classics accordingly has to be quoted precisely. We know enough. Well, some are saying that we know 90% of the whole stuff. Whether we talk about global hydrology, whether we talk about water quality, nanotechnologies involved, or membranes and all the rest of it. So this is just applications. And the rest, the 10%, is capacity development. Fine. So what do you think? Do we know enough? Do we have enough data upon which knowledge is based? Do we have the information upon which management decisions are to be based? Rick Lawford has mentioned that unless you measure it, you can't manage it. And that's a strong message what the politicians often don't hear. So I would like to open for a few questions or comments to what so far the panel has mentioned. Is there anybody who would like to contribute at this stage? Balázs. No, don't resist. Don't move. The mic is coming.
Do we know enough? I mean, to my mind, if you listen to Kevin Trembers, who is a well-known climatologist and GCM modelers, and you read his papers about the missing heat, I think by itself it's a testimony of what we don't know about the climate. So I think this whole climate change research went ahead promoting ideas without having the solid basis of what they're promoting. So that's my
thank you so much, sir. This is a pretty strong statement. Any climate scientist in the room who would vehemently disagree? Over there, there's one. No disagreement. Good. Can we have the mic over there, please? Here. Raise your hand, please. Thank you. And if you could kindly introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Catherine Allen. I'm not a climate scientist, but I guess this is the whole point of adaptive management, which we've been talking about for a few days here, is that, yes, we have to manage with what we've got, but we recognise that there are things we're never going to be able to know because things are changing us around us. So I think rather than talking about adaptive management, we need to start living adaptive management. Of course, we have to manage now with the 90% or the 70% or the 50%, whatever it is, in the knowledge that we have to keep learning. So I think learning is one of the things I haven't heard a lot. We talk about data gaps. I think there are things we need to do through management, which is getting into the doing side of things, not just continually trying to find data. So it's just a reminder about the sort of true meaning of adaptive management.
Thank you. Jakob, shall we return back to the question?
Yes.
So the question was here that what is it what the political community and the policy community is expecting from the global water science community?
Yes, I would like to join my colleague and say I can't resist. I would like to follow up on uncertainties shortly. I was a bit nervous when you introduced the panel, saying that here is policymakers and decision makers are sitting. I consider myself as kind of a scientist here, but I can point to this from what I see as a scientist and from where I see where policymakers like us and don't like us, not just from my work at United Nations University, but also my former 10 years where I was responsible in a research institute for operational duties in natural hazards management. Of course, we never know enough. Of course, we have our gaps, but my answer to this would be take it easy. We are making decisions in our daily lives everywhere, the whole day with uncertainty. Why should science be the only domain where we can't make decisions with uncertainty? So I think this is really something we have to provide as scientists. Try to see what kind of conclusions can be made with existing gaps. I am going to tell you a very short story. It's not a long one. I have about a year ago I have heard a presentation by an African hydrologist. He's a professor at MIT now. He has given a talk about long-term water management in Africa. He has started with displaying model results, different models, different scenarios on the long-term development of precipitation. I've not checked his results, but what he said is that there are only 10% of area in Africa where the models agree even on the sign. So to say, they don't even agree in 90% of the area whether we'll have more or less precipitation. So he asked, well, management on the basis of what? Does this mean that we cannot say anything? And he said, oh no, we can say quite a lot. By putting this whole uncertainty in the development perspective, not just looking at it from science, but looking at it, what is needed, what do we need? So there were very clear points coming out. We have to develop our forecasting capacity, very clear task to science. We have to improve irrigation system. We have to improve reservoir systems. So there is a lot where science can help, even without knowing the details about the development. So, and I think it should be a very interesting challenge for science and an interesting scientific challenge to deal with these uncertainties, to try to extract things that can be said with the uncertainties. Of course, another branch is to diminish these uncertainties, but new ones will occur. So I think science should just look at uncertainties as a very natural part of their life. Never take it as a reason not to make statements.
Yeah, just 1 second, because Fritz would like to make a short comment on this.
I think in this context it would help to apply the distinction Joachim von Braun made this morning between things at risk and uncertainty. In a lot of our debates, the two things are really mixed up, and I think this would help a lot to get clarity and a clearer line on that.
Well, a job of a diplomat is not uncertain but risky. So how would you like to say that from a diplomat point of view? What would you expect from the global water science community?
Well, thank you. I think I'd rather say a few words about what my personal experience suggests, how messages can be or should be formulated. I worked in the past 15 years very closely with politicians. Now I'm seeing the President of the Republic on almost a weekly basis, which is a very strange experience, but he is the sort of patron of this big water conference that we're putting together. So I have to be, very sharp on things. And I think there are a number of developments in the way politics has developed that really scientists should also look at. The first thing is that we have talked about, and maybe it's become sort of a proverbial saying, science and policy interface. But I think it's wrong. We should talk about science and politics interface. This is what Fritz was referring to. Because at the end of the day, most of the decisions, at least the binding decisions, are made by politicians. And if we want to catch their attention, we should know the world they're operating in. And I think there are a number of important developments which probably some of them are new, but maybe they have been accelerated. The first probably is this: we live in this extreme speed of image-driven politics. So if you have a website I've been told this by a communications expert, if you have a website which catches the attention of somebody for more than 8 seconds, then it's already a success. Because apparently you just open a website, you look at the first 3 or 4 new posts, and then if there's nothing, you quit it. And you do like 30 of those within 3-4 minutes or 5 minutes. I actually left my smartphone in Budapest last night, which is an immense pleasure actually, because I'm not checking stupid websites because of somebody who's speaking is boring, or I'm not checking emails. But this also shows how politics works. So basically, you have very, very short attention spans. Firstly, because everybody is overloaded with images and news and everything with what happens, and of course politicians have to select a number of those things, which they find important. Maybe another important feature is how sort of tabloid-driven politics has become to a large extent. Tabloid papers and internet sites are very much driving politics, which of course very much influences the phraseology of politicians themselves. So if you want to really catch the attention of politicians, you have to be able to sort of use some of those techniques, and of course scientists would take to hear that, but and it's a sort of a fundamental sort of phrase or instruction within political journalism is the simplify and exaggerate. And to many people, the Millennium Development Goals are just like that. Very simple message, very simple targets, which of course completely escape the complexity of the problems, but in a way that has been one of the most successful political products of the United Nations system. So if you want to, again, talk to politicians, I think it's very important that apparently we have heard there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of risk. A proper natural scientist would hate to write things down like that. But if it has, if it has some strong fundamentals, this message should be distilled and communicated probably in a simple fashion. And I think one suggestion or maybe conclusion, which I think has been very, very evident in the business community, is that talking to politicians is a profession on its own. So it's not only that, we have scientists who should be able to formulate their messages in a way that politicians listen to or are capable of absorbing. Probably, that interface is not a direct thing. There should be somebody like a communications manager or a public affairs manager, in a rude word, a lobbyist, who can actually transform those messages to politicians. And we have already heard it from Claudia that some kind of, water think tank, global water think tank, with the particular purpose transmitting complex messages into sort of politically consumable phraseology or a verbal structure would be a very important achievement. Apparently, businesses do that. We have tons of lobbyists, those who work in governments. People come to you, and normally they understand your language. So they have a business message, and they translate it into such a way that you can actually put it into legislation. And I think this has been missing from the sort of science or politics interface. Partly because scientists are trained to do something else. This is their job. But we need somebody who manages their messages in such a way that can be easily integrated into the political decision making. And maybe one final comment on the substance. I was just on Sunday and Monday at the Asia Pacific Water Summit, which was a big political gathering in Thailand. And to some extent, many people can say it was just a political showcase for the Thai government and a number of politicians. There were a number of interesting features of that conference. Basically, there was a huge opening panel with a lot of politicians, and an even bigger closing panel with an even number of bigger politicians like the Sultan of Brunei and a number of heads of states and government. And in between, there was a very, very short session with the heads of various regional UN institutions, and apparently a number of very small sort of workshops which hardly anybody attended. So basically, my conclusion was that science was hardly mentioned ever during that 2 days. The second is it was mainly focusing on two subjects. First was the disaster risk management, saying that the Asia Pacific or 90% of all sorts of disasters related to water in the world, and 80% of that happens in the Asia Pacific area. So for them, that's an absolute imperative, a political and personal imperative. The second was the human needs, the human, including agriculture, energy, etc. Very little, again, has been said about this sort of natural or ecological demands. But I think this carries a message for us that if you want to be successful as the science community vis-a-vis politicians, we should know what is the demand. As Fritz was saying, to some extent, the whole water science was demand-driven. If something happened, then respond to that. And I think it's very important that the science has, at the time, some kind of readily available messages if a particular problem arises. Because if you just paint the big picture, which is not very topical with politicians at that time, then they won't catch the word. And of course, the water issue is so complex that you always have one or two big issues. If there's floods, you can always package a number of things on top, like climate change or the energy nexus. Or if there's a big road, then again you can bring up the climate change and a number of other things, IWRM. So I think it's very important to see this sort of broad horizon, what is happening in politics and how you can actually infiltrate into that. And even though I said that to some extent we should use the simplify and exaggerate maxim for the intrusion of science into the political world, probably we should avoid the sort of scare scenario of the climate change negotiations, because to some extent I think that has proved absolutely unproductive. There were the big collapse scenarios basically every 5th year, or I don't know how many years we have the new IPCC report, and you can sort of raise the attention of the public and politicians from time to time. The last time when we had this huge hype was in 2009, before the Conference of the Parties in Copenhagen, when everybody talked about a grand breakthrough in the medias. And if you looked at the realities of the concrete negotiations, nothing was happening. I mean, hundreds of miles away we were from an actual decision, and that resulted in a huge in a huge unsatisfaction with the public and a complete loss of faith in this sort of science. Science said catastrophe is nearby, politicians didn't listen, this cannot be done. So basically, I think at least in the field of climate change, we have got to a stage where I think the steam is out, and we should be very careful that in the field of water we don't lose the steam, at least certainly not prematurely. So that is what my message. Thanks.
So, although we are still in the round of asking the panelists what they wish the scientists to answer within, let's say, the next decade, I think this raised very pronouncedly the question of communication between science and politics, and therefore we would like to ask the audience what they think could be done to improve this. In almost every second talk, I heard that this was a major issue for transferring scientific results into action. And the question I'm now having, maybe someone of you has some good ideas or suggestions, how could this interface be improved? And we already had some ideas today. In this talk of Mrs. Paul-Wostel, there was the suggestion to establish permanent platforms, either global, maybe also regional, nationally, for this interface between scientists and practitioners and administrators in this area. And then there was another suggestion which said we need moderators. So we need a new kind of people being active at this interface. And I would like to get your response or feedback. What do you think about these ideas?
Thank you. I'm David Grenfelt from the Water Culture Institute. I think we're talking about the wrong interface. Rather than science and policy, where there doesn't seem to be a lot of interest across that interface, I think we need to talk about ethics and action and the ethics-action interface. Because we know that we don't have enough information. And we know that politicians don't act on that information anyway. They act on other things. So why are we kind of beating our heads against the wall? I think we would get more productive insights if we looked at the values underlying action. Because the people who are acting out the water policies are not the policy makers. They make the broad policies. But the people who are implementing action around water are at a lower level. It's the water utilities, industries, cities, NGOs in terms of deciding how to invest their own activities, researchers in terms of allocating their own resources and what they study. Those are the people who are practically applying values, ethics, to inform their own behavior, but they're not that aware of what their own values are. They're operating blindly. And I think that we've talked around and around the issue of attitudes, ethics, values, without really addressing them. And I think it's not surprising that we keep coming back to the same problems, and we wonder why we're facing the same problems. I think we need to look at it in a different way, and what I suggest is that we introduce a parallel interface, if you can say, of the ethics or values dimension and the action behavioral dimension, and look at how those values motivate particular actions, and then apply science and policies to that, and instead of having just two things, have four things, have a box instead of an interface. Thank you.
Yeah. Is there another comment? Yeah.
I'm Joe Della Penna, professor of law at Villanova University. I want to pick up on a point that Ambassador Baranyai made about the need to translate scientific knowledge or ethics or anything else in the language suitable for legislation. I think that's absolutely right, and I think it highlights a very serious omission at this conference. The almost total absence of discussion about legal principles, law and practice, or anything along those lines. There are very, very few law-trained people here, and those who spoke were shunted off into obscure so-called standard sessions, which guaranteed no one was going to hear them. And yet this is very essential. Not only are lawyers in the business of translating other kinds of knowledge into laws and into decisions that are being made about disputes, but they draw upon what I like to think of as the distilled wisdom, when we're talking about water, of 4,000 years of water law. If you're going to try to address legislation or to apply laws, and you don't understand that 4,000 years of legal evolution, which Joyita Gupta and I edited a book about, you're going to always be reinventing the wheel. You're going to be starting from a base of ignorance. And you should not be surprised if all you produce is a rather primitive wheel, when there's a great fund of knowledge that you could build on to move things forward, and which you're ignoring in this process, and which you need to bring in. Now, this is not something I'm saying as a way of advancing myself personally, because I'm frankly reaching the end of my career. I'm 70 years old. I'm not going to be active too much longer. But it's a serious omission in your studies. You're talking constantly about interdisciplinarity, about the need to integrate knowledge, and yet you're ignoring a very fundamentally important body of knowledge. And so I think you should take that into account. Now, I can give you some practical examples. I'll just throw one out. A number of the speakers here have mentioned markets without discussing them in any significant detail, and they mention them in the past in a way that suggests that this is sort of settled issue, background information. Everybody knows markets will do this or that. Well, the truth of the matter is everybody doesn't know that. Markets, in fact, are highly contentious. You can look at countries like the United States, which is obviously where I do most of my work, which is very strongly committed to free markets in general. One branch or one political party in the United States is at the far extreme in terms of commitment to free markets, and yet we have not been able to make markets work successfully for water. There's a great deal of hype about how water markets have solved Chile's problems, and yet empirical research shows us that water markets virtually don't function in Chile. They exist on paper, they don't function. Nobody wants to talk about that. Australia, you're getting similar hype, greatly exaggerating the success of markets. Water lawyers know what it takes to create laws that create a possibility of markets. They can educate you about that, and they can also tell you why, in general, they don't work except at the very small scale. But you've cut yourself off from that source of information. And so if you're really talking about scientists being able to communicate with policymakers in ways that can be effectuated, this would be true for ethicists as well, by the way. Being able to communicate with policymakers in a way that is suitable for legislation, for regulation, and so on, or for that matter, transboundary agreements or contracts, which ultimately are legal instruments. You need to draw upon the knowledge of water, well, lawyers in general, water lawyers specifically. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. If there are no more comments, we could proceed, but what we received so far is from both sides a clear answer to the question, is communication important? And all of you say, yes, it is. And so I think this would probably be a major issue or a feature also in developing the global water systems further on. And then from what you all say is that is a point that need to be focused on in the future still, even though it's not a new point to address, but there need to be methods developed in order to proceed further on. And with that, I would give the microphone back to Mrs. Lidia. The question we had is, if you had one wish free, let's place it like this, what would you want science to solve for you within the next 10 years?
To be honest, I really think that's the very wrong question. I was listening and you keep repeating the question, and for me that's not the point. The point is why it's science, politics, society not talking enough and understanding each other enough so that you don't have to ask that question to a very few of us that are not even anymore politicians anyway. So it's the wrong question to the wrong people. And unfortunately, I think that's what's happening in many of our interactions. I think the first thing I would like to throw to you is that we live in a polar world. We like it or not. It's a polarized world. When you talk about the politicians more and more have short-term agendas. Most of them nowadays don't even survive a full term. So it's a very, very short, not only a short attention span, but really a short action space, because it's very short, the political lives. But we need long-term policies. So how can the science community support politicians in giving them enough knowledge and action space for at a short time, but at the same time being able to build sustain the structural base so that long-term policies will appear? Because policies are longer term than politicians. So for me, the first thing that we have to think is when we interact with politicians and with political and policy institutions, how can we deliver the knowledge we have at the time for short-term actions, but done so in a way that those actions build long-term policies? I think that's the first issue that I would like to raise. The other one I think has been raised before is this issue of certainty and uncertainty. One thing is risk, another thing is uncertainty. And I agree very much with, I think it was you that said, if it's certain and there is risk, talk about risk. If it's uncertain, then don't talk about risk. Say, we don't know enough. What we know is that this is the trend. But to confuse both creates this complication between, and politicians like certainty, even when there's risk. They like to know. If what they do about it is a different story. But at least they take a risk informed. And I think science is very responsible for that. And then this discussion, law, no law, social science, economics, biodiversity, water, we agree with this, we don't agree with that. Disciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity is a constant tension. Again, I think the scientific community as a whole has to get their act together. Because sometimes you see in meetings that are about global sustainability, the different sciences being able to talk to each other. But when it comes to their own program, then you are defending. No, but this is water. It's a little bit different from what you do, I don't know, with something else. And this tension needs to be used to really create the need to work together. And I don't think we are using well. So this would be something I would like to see from the scientific community, to use this tension and this debate, these different perspectives of the different sciences, to really build true interdisciplinary knowledge. And I think it can be done. It's a matter of really using the tension correctly. Then is this question about unknown connections, and hidden connections and known connections. Most of the time, we use the known connections because they are easier. That's what we do. We know that the politicians read the major newspaper in the country, so we try to publish a very nice science public kind of language. But what are the hidden connections? What really makes a politician or an individual or a group of individuals to take a decision? And many times we don't understand this also. So it's quite important to understand. And for me, this is why I don't like to speak from science policy interface or science politics interface. I really say it's science policy society interface, because a lot of the hidden connections has to do with society. How the public sees the politicians, their decisions, their space for action, how society can influence politics. And more, and with the new media, more and more. So I think we have to understand this tension between economic interests, social and environmental sustainability. Again, how can we, when we deliver the knowledge we have, always have these aspects together? Not just one, not just the other. It's again a balance. How can we say, pardon, talking too much, economics, social, environment. So, balance. Political objectives and languages. We just talked about it. Science, objectives and language. Definitely there is a language that we have to develop that is a frank language everybody can understand. But that also means whose question we are answering. That's why I was saying at the beginning, your question is wrong. Because we are not the ones who should say to the water global community, research community, what are the things we want them to study next, or to answer next. I think it's really up to this community to get with their stakeholders at the different levels, across scales, and say, what questions can water research answer in order to make us live better in a more sustainable way? But it's not us. So whose question, whose agenda? I think it's the major issue that we need to address in research. And finally, just to say that, for me, most importantly, when you finally have the question, don't kill it with quick answers. Keep the question alive as you deliver knowledge that can help people to choose the right answer for the right moment, for the right community. Just don't kill the question, because we also sometimes are in the pressure of trying to know everything and answer all the questions people put to us. Thank you.
Well, it's my turn. Well, last year, 2012, there's about more than 10 nations changed their leaders, right? So we are all, Korea is one of those 10 nations that had a new president. And as time goes on, I mean, this is the age of super connection. We are all living in a super connected. So political campaigning becoming so popular, geared towards popularism. So when we bring the value of society for the development of nation, it's not easy. It's always, in the politician's point of view, it's related to welfare, popularistic campaigning track. So during those very severe, strong political process of our selecting president last year, I sort of thought, well, society should need new way of new way of moving forward in this social media and everything. In the morning, we mentioned of citizens' data and database for the world. I think that is very critical. So communicating each other, in various units, not only nation, but different stakeholders. We can be easily connected. Multi-stakeholders in different regions, in different nations can be connected. I think, so we need new way of adjusting to change the world. So science is one way of doing the things. By science, as we all mentioned, we specifically invented some innovation for certain water shortage and sanitation issues. But as a social scientist myself, I think that is very critical, answering each water problems. But I'm not talking about ethics, but the management of this social grouping and making decisions should be really developed through education. I don't know whether you are well aware of that Education for Sustainable Development, which has been studied in Rio Plus 10 in Johannesburg. So next year celebrates the decade of education for sustainable development. So as a person who's been engaged in that area for the last 10 years, there are a lot of diverse definitions on SD, of course. We are talking about balancing 3 pillars, economic, social, and environment. But ESD is also related to that. But I personally think ESD, Education for Sustainable Development, is problem-solving teaching. How in this world, yesterday we just watched in England, this guy, butchered a soldier to death. So we are living in this world. So we need to know how to live in peaceful world. So water is so basic, so fundamental. And these days I go around saying that not water is life. I say water is death. 70-80% of our body without drinking water, another death, digester. It's all death-linked element is water. So in this world, we have to find a way of living peacefully. And we are living in this super-connected age. So use this, very, very well-developed way of connecting each other, communicating each other. So that I think the ultimate goal of human society and nature is peaceful coexistence. I think we have to realize that, aware that we are living in this connected age, and find a way to move to that, direction. Thank you.
It's quite difficult to follow that deeply philosophical point, but I would like to try and return to your question and try and be very specific. When I look at the sort of information you were putting out about the global water crisis, if you like, I think that it's pretty obvious that particularly in Asia we're going to have to find ways of constraining water use in agriculture but increasing water productivity in agriculture as one of the major issues. And the other one is about urban. But if I go to that first one, I do think that the sort of information that's coming out of the global community and even the science community more broadly in relation to that is not quite hitting the point. You need as Joachim von Braun said, you need to connect water quantity issues with water quality issues and feedbacks much more closely than we've been doing. So I'd like to see a concerted effort, I think, between water scientists and agricultural scientists working across that frontier. In other words, because always, looking back through my career, and I suspect through all of our careers in the European water business, we've always been playing catch-up with land use change. We've never really anticipated the full nature of feedback, the cost of feedback, all the externalities of pushing land harder and so on. And I think that that science really needs to get ahead of that game a little bit now, bearing in mind that we've got a global crisis in the area as opposed to some rather wasteful European practice previously in the area of common agricultural policy, for example. So I'd like to see that figuring as a definite science output, trying to keep it very much there. The other one is, and I don't think it quite relates to the global community directly, but many people here mentioned the urbanization trends, again, particularly in Asia and West Africa. And, I've certainly tried to work in what people are beginning to call integrated urban water resources management, but it needs science in there as well as systems engineering, and it needs them to get together and look at the entire water energy stream through cities and how can you cope. And I think that is not really taken off. There are people doing it, but it hasn't taken off in a concerted way. Some of the best modelers who can model urban systems are actually not looking at some of the cities that most need modeling. But by saying those rather factual points, I don't in any way want to disagree with one or two of the points that are coming up here about communication, because I do think that this is a critical but different area. And on the issue of mixed messages, it scare me, mixed messages and confusing messages. And I don't know whether we've got time, chair people, for a particular issue here, coming back to my home ground of groundwater. If you look at India, an awful lot of those red marks on your maps are India, and they're groundwater related indirectly. And if you look at peninsular India, these are small storage aquifers that were very important in getting the green revolution in peninsular India to take off. But obviously, they've been pushed too hard. And we've got to get back to using them in a more balanced way. But if you look at the way in which that message has got out, you learn something about the wrong sort of messages. First of all, it was the water table was falling, and that stimulated the well drilling business, deeper wells, and the local pump industry business, and became a major vested interest group. But in fact, nobody was talking about how much storage was left, and in this area, it's not much. Few years monsoon rainfall. These are not big, deep aquifers. And so we move on then, and there was then the next quick fix or panacea coming out of policymakers, which was we've got to recharge more and we've got to have more efficient irrigation. In other words, reduce the demand and increase the supply. But the reality is that it's certainly a very valuable practice, harvesting more water from the land to aquifers, but it might have been going somewhere else. You've got to understand those linkages. You've also got to understand there are limits to that, and you've got to be careful that when it translates to the political level, it doesn't just become a license for earth moving, which is what it tended to do, recharge everywhere and at any cost. And likewise, efficient irrigation is a dangerous sort of word. Obviously, more efficient irrigation saves energy, but it doesn't always save water, because in many of these permeable soils, most of the inefficient water was returning to the aquifer. And farmers began to think that they were saving water and they could use a bit more, where in reality they were saving energy, but relatively little water. So these simple messages are not good enough for the nature of the problems we're facing. And somehow or other, science has got to be able to put across the real issue. The real issue at the end is how can water and agriculture get together to increase productivity and reduce consumptive demand in those constrained areas. Whereas you just go up country in India, and some people in India talk as if it's one nation, and in the Indo-Gangetic Plain you've got enormous storage. And you can over-pump aquifers for very long periods to support grain production, if you want to do that, if you want to do it as a conscious decision and you know where you're going. It could be, in many areas, at the price of creeping salinization, which is a very serious externality. But at the moment, we're doing it fairly blind. We're not really getting the science debate down to the local management reality, even in those big problems. And very often, the political message is picked up early, oversimplified, and probably a lot of money is spent going away from sustainability for not much benefit other than, shall we say, short-term local employment schemes. I'm speaking hard here, but that is the way it is. And lastly, my final word would be that everybody agrees that adaptive management has to be the name of the game, and it had to be the name of the game even if the climate wasn't changing with the rate of population growth and land use change and so on. But when you look at trying to do adaptive management at the local level, which is where it has to happen largely with water, you know, at the end of the day, I feel very strongly on this point. The amount of investment on local, reasonable monitoring to inform adaptive management in the majority of countries, and the employment status and the general regard for people working in local water resource management agencies is very low. And until you can raise that, I think that they're going to have a difficulty in really confronting the realities of management on the ground. They are very small fry in terms of the bigger economic debate in local development.
Well, until the mic is coming down to Fritz, who has a comment, there's one thing perhaps for the next phase of the Global Water System Project to be considered, is that 90% of the unfrozen water is under the surface. And that is a huge adaptation capability, or it provides a huge capability, although as Stephen has pointed out, humanity has a tendency to screw up those aquifers in a totally irreversible manner, which we have done so far. Fritz.
I thought, what can we learn from IPCC from a water perspective? I will not make an assessment about all the findings and all the evidence. But what we can learn, and what, from my point of view, was the strength of IPCC. If you see, 1988, IPCC had been founded. Now we are in 2013. If you go around the globe, it depends on the length of parliamentary seasons. 4 to 6 times governments all over the world had changed. But the issue had been kept on the agenda. And this, I think, beside if there is a socialist or a conservative or another government, science in climate made sure through IPCC that this issue remained on the political agenda throughout all this period. And what is necessary to think about is there a possibility that, not an IPCC on water, now we have one on biodiversity. We cannot start the same fragmentation we have complaints about now in the environment. But what can we do to make sure that the water issue remains on the agenda in a prominent way? And I think there science has a clear role on that. And I think we are not starting from scratch. A kind of compendium we already have as the World Water Assessment reports and the development reports, where we are working on and where we have in a condensed way on the table our knowledge we have in water. We need more, but this is in essence what we need to make sure that the scientific developments on one hand side and the political developments on the other hand side are more synchronized. So science has a function to make sure that the issues, the burning issues, have not the lifetime of politicians. This would be really disastrous. Science has to make sure that the lifetime of burning issues are longer than the lifetime of politicians. And this means for water that we have to make sure that a lot of what we are doing in a very fragmented way in water research, this is the case all over the world, a bit more or less in different countries, but we have to make sure that over this very fragmented approach in research in water, we have a line of substance on water where we make sure that this issue is kept on the agenda.
Well, no, there's no problem with I think, recognizing that the climate community has done a much better deal and business as the water community. If you talk to politicians who often use climate and weather as synonyms, so they, it's a mild understatement that they don't understand even the basics. But everybody, if you talk to politicians, speaks about climate and then becomes very serious and says that, oh yes, this is a very important problem. But very few recognize that climate change manifests itself basically through with and by water, whether you talk about sea level rise due to heat expansion, or you talk about increased flood frequencies, or increased drought durations, or biodiversity changes, or rainfall pattern changes. This is all about water. And then somehow we haven't got that message through to the political community. We were always saying that, oh, water is going to be the 21st century big problem, but we never had very simple arguments, although sometimes the politicians tend to have this tendency of oversimplifying matters. Von Braun made a very important statement in his presentation, and perhaps that could be an important consideration in designing the next phase of the global water system project. And this is, quote, put people into the center of the water agenda. This is a very simple message, but very powerful. Don't detach human development from sustainable development. They are parts of one another in a yin-yang relationship. So that I think ought to be perhaps the leitmotif in building the next phase. Because he said, and this is what I would like to pick your brain in the panel, another thing which I think was a very important message, also for the hardcore science community, but more importantly for our social scientist brothers and sisters. And he said, institutional innovations lack behind technology innovation. This is what made Fritz say that, well, a big part of the job is done when it comes to hardcore science or hardcore engineering. But the soft part, which is by order of magnitude more difficult because it has ethical considerations or it has legal considerations, as Joe Della Peña has mentioned, these are things which I think we still need to include a little bit more into our, well, a great deal more into our future debate. So I would like to have your views on this statement, institutional innovations lack behind technology innovations, and what is it what we should do about it? Jakob, would you like to start that?
Yeah, I think we should include it right from the beginning in the research in the research proposals. I think when I look and the situation is improving, but when you look at research proposals as they are made now, take for example FP7 of the European Union, there is always a very well elaborated, of course, very well elaborated research part, and it is distinguishable between different research projects. However, when you go to the application side, there is often a very small chapter which is called dissemination. So a series of workshops, after 3 years the project is gone, and the transfer is happening in a very randomized way. So I think a lot of responsibility on the science side is with the research funders. This has to be honored, this has to be financed. This is a problem for now I speak as a scientist, that the, so to say, the work on the institutional frame is not honored, because you do a lot of work without writing much papers out of it. So thinking about the careers of the scientists, I think is very useful to go back to what a politician drives. He has to think about his career. Scientists have to think about his career himself. So I think this institutional part of the research projects is, I would not say completely, but much in the hands of the funding organizations. They can really drive it. We are trying. There is a new initiative called Future Earth. I don't have time to go into this into describing it. Many of you may have heard it, but we're thinking a lot about this part of the science, also about measuring, about honoring system of this part. So to kind of try to see that the institutional part can catch up with science.
Thank you. Well, we have two lawyers in the panel, and I would like to pick their brains. Particularly provoked by the question what Joe was asking, or rather stating that the legal principles were missing in the first part of the project, and he sees that this is really a hiatus we have to discuss. Although the rest of the crowd here, the hardcore scientists who are dealing with uncertainty, risk, probabilistic statements, distribution functions, fuzzy sets, end of the distribution, that seems they're using a different language. Lawyers who are very, very strict, and it's almost like a deterministic thing. How do they perceive that changing reality, that perhaps we have to get the concept of probability somehow included into the legal system? Because things like floods, like droughts, like anything you do, or like disasters, they have a random component. And lawyers are pretty strict guys, and they said, forget about distributions. Give me the facts, give me the number, and that's it. Fritz, how would you comment on that?
I am András. I am not a lawyer. I am an economist. So I cannot make a clear statement. I think we should pass the microphone to Gábor.
Thank you. I am actually a lawyer. Well, I think that there have been a number of questions here. First about institutions and how institutional issues play a role in this big water community discourse. I of course don't have a good answer. We heard examples from the institutionalization or institutions on research. I may just like to refer to political institutions, and one particular kind, which I think is getting a hot issue all over the world, even more with climate change, population pressures, so on and so forth. And this is the international sort of river basin cooperation. Without making a long story of this, there have been a number of comparative studies, I think mainly Europe, and it seems that the European models, and particularly the International Commission for the Protection of the River Danube, the ICPDR, it may be the most successful of those. So I think it's very important that this model becomes known all over the world. It's already actually quite well selling knowledge products in other difficult river basins, just coming from the Mekong region. They really look at what ICPDR has been doing. So I think first there has to be a research of successful institutions, political science again, and this should be put in the Sustainable Development Goals in one way or another. Here today already governance questions have been raised quite, I think, eloquently. And Hungary, you may know, is volunteering with a major conference in October, the Budapest Water Summit. which has the ultimate objective of sort of laying down the main building blocks of an SDG, of a Sustainable Development Goal, a draft SDG on water. And from the very first moment, we thought that governance and institutions should be part of it, because if you don't have any proper governance structure, national and international, then that will be the whole missing thing. Very often the water community says, okay, we have the technology, we have even sometimes the money, but we don't have the people and the structures to implement them. So that was sort of my brief answer to your first question. But the most immediate question about legal principles and how legal systems can handle uncertainty. I think there are already a number of legal responses to that. And this is very much embedded in a number of principles of environmental law, which actually go back to the first Rio Conference or even further. And this is actually applied in a number of areas, particularly with regard to chemicals and genetically modified organisms, where the novelty of the products is such that basically there's no way to test anything in advance. So naturally, in the whole process, there's a huge degree of uncertainty, and basically there's a set of principles which are supposed to address this decision-making dilemma, to go ahead with something or to hold it back until science delivers something conclusive. And basically, there are two principles: the prevention principle, and the other is the precautionary principle. Basically, the first says that priority is prevent any damage from, or it's better to prevent damage than let it go and repair afterwards. And the other is that if there's a degree of scientific uncertainty in the decision making, nevertheless there's a degree of certainty that something bad may happen, then it's already an obligation or a possibility not to go ahead with a particular project or intervention. But basically, this relates to a number of very direct human interventions, which may not be applicable to uncertainties into the client science. So basically, the precautionary principle was developed to hold decision makers back when there's a degree of uncertainty about the bad thing that may happen, but there's a certain degree of certainty that it may happen. But apparently, if we use this analogy, for example, to the climate change, then we could say that we rather hold back until science clears everything. And then if, scientific evidence is delivered, then, okay, let's do the thing. So probably what the law has already developed in the field of addressing scientific uncertainty may not be good enough. So I very much would concur with the gentleman who spoke about this issue, that there has to be some important legal developments in this field. I think water has been rather seen as a managerial issue. I've been dealing a lot with European water legislation and also international one, and probably the European Water Framework Directive is a revolutionary piece of legislation that wouldn't be adopted today, which tries to deal with the complexity of water both from the point of view of this physical water cycle and the interconnected nature of all these rivers and lakes in this sort of international political environment. But it has nothing really, or very little actually, handling these kind of uncertainties as to what may come. So I think I'm a bit helpless, but it was a very good question to raise the attention to the lacuna of the legal profession on to this issue.
Okay, thank you very much with your perspective on how to deal with scientific uncertainty from a lawyer's perspective also. And there was also one comment on the question of how to integrate the institutions more tightly into research projects. And that was Mr. Foster who wanted to give a comment. Yeah, I thought you raised your hand. Oh, okay.
I raised my hand really to respond to the original question or statement that András made, repeating the message of Jakob von Braun in relation to the need for institutional innovation and institutional reform to make progress here. And certainly that it mirrors our little experience in the 10 years of the World Bank work on local groundwater management. But I think there has been some progress. I mean, we, in that program, had a strong legal participation, and they looked at the laws of, I think, the 20 countries that we were working in, and decided that, in general, the legal powers were there, but the institutional framework to implement those laws was extremely weak. There wasn't enough accountability, enough process to follow, and enough budget, and so on and so forth. This was the big problem. And some innovation, we saw innovation going on in different ways and tried to stimulate it, and I thought I might mention one or two of those, because I think they're sort of rays of hope in this pretty difficult area. One is and funnily enough, these sort of issues probably are more relevant to the larger federal-type countries than the smaller unitary countries like England, where I come from, or Thailand, where everybody in water management is all working for one agency, be they local and or national, and basically the big challenges are how to communicate horizontally to the other sectors, the cross-sectoral stuff. But you get fairly major problems in the big federal countries, even crossing the water quantity, water quality divide, crossing the local agencies in relation to surface water management and groundwater management, for example. And that's where where innovation is beginning to occur. And the sorts of things that seem to offer hope in the rural context or in the agriculture context to me were, basically the lack of efficient conjunctive use of surface and groundwater in many countries where that offers an enormous opportunity for the future. But it's actually impeded the institutions of government, at least, or they actually mirror the status quo. They're an obstacle to trying to manage water better. And creation of small apex agencies in which you brigade in from the other bodies, some leading players, and have a small apex agency at state level or whatever, catchment level, whatever you're talking about, gives much more ability for them to then get across sectors than this myriad of small agencies dealing with water, which tends to happen in more countries than you might think. The other issue is users' self-management, the major step. That normally is only possible in terms of resource management in small and very clearly defined subcatchments or aquifer units or groundwater bodies. It's difficult to replicate in the big areas. But there's some good examples out there now which need, studying and replication where possible of that partnership with users doing most of the management and government facilitating and nurturing it. That's going on to a degree. That I think is institutionally innovative. And thirdly, in urban areas, the whole urban water environment, water infrastructure, and broader infrastructure issue is so big that basically, and so fast-moving, that water agencies the typical water resource agency can't touch it. You've got to get something like a special platform for urban water management in which all the stakeholders are there, and the big players are there. And there is good examples of that in one or two Asian countries and even one or two Latin American countries. I'm leaving aside the more industrialized world. And those things need, I think, institutionalizing more so that they have a recognized status. And secondly, they need scientific support. They don't always get it. They're not always well informed. But that to me is an institutional innovation that offers hope for the future. And I think that I agree exactly, precisely with the statement. That's probably the biggest obstacles to improving efficiency and productivity of water use, and indeed conserving water for ecosystems, is in the institutional area.
Well, let us gradually converge to the summing up of this discussion. And then Mike is going then to Lidia and then to Fritz. But before you do that, the last question that I would like to have your reflection upon is related to the role the Global Water System Project could play in defining the Sustainable Development Goals and shaping the post-2015 development agenda. As you know, there's a huge debate going on within the UN circles. And as you also recall, the designers of the Millennium Development Goals somehow have forgotten Albert Einstein's dictum, which reads, make things simple, but no simpler. And they make it more simple than it should have been by defining the MDGs that are no good. If you look at the water supply MDG, the other day the Secretary General has announced that the goal to halve the number of human beings who have no access to safe drinking water at the time, that was 1.4 billion, is today down to 700 million, so we are on track globally, but not universally. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa, things are not improving very much. If you look at the sanitation goal, it's even worse than before because it was not precisely defined. Therefore, some say that the Sustainable Development Goals should be just the continuation of the WASH goals, water supply, sanitation, hygiene, because we still have unfinished business. Others are saying that these are elements to sustainability, but they do not provide an answer because we have climate change adaptation strategies, we have flood resilience measures, we have groundwater management, transboundary catchment. So what are the Sustainable Development Goals in the water sanitation area, which at the same time meet, from Brown's dictum, make development human-centered? And I would like to pick your brain, and we have 5 minutes to answer this simple question.
Okay, but maybe allow me to come back to this innovation of institutions. As I said in the beginning, one of the things that I saw this community starting to do, very much to my liking, was to address governance issues. But a lot has to be done there. And I think not just the water research community, but many of our scientific communities, what we are not doing yet is to do research how to redesign policy-making processes and decision-making processes. We don't understand sometimes how science can influence the different steps of decision-making. Most of the time we see science, like your question now, how can we influence the Sustainable Development Goals process? But cannot be an ad hoc thing. We need to understand how the decisions are taken and then try to permeate the different levels and timely, because that's always the problem with decision making. It has to be timely. And so I think there is a lot that needs to be done in that research area of understanding how policy making, how decision making processes related to water is done, and how to redesign and to influence the redesign of decision making. So you were talking about from local to national to global. How does this across scale plays a role in taking the right or the wrong decision in relation to water resources? The second aspect on the Sustainable Development Goals, I think a lot of what was discussed today has a lot of space to inform the debate. But it needs to be done very quickly. It has to be done in different levels. If I can share with you our experience with Rio, plus 20, when the four global exchange programs decide to do Planet Under Pressure, it was 2 years before Rio plus 20. But the conference, we could only organize for March of the year of the summit. So we knew we are going to be late. So the discussion was, what can we do to influence the process? Then we identified a very good opportunity, the Global Sustainability Panel. And that was much easier for the scientific community to interact with them. So we had a lot of meetings, private meetings, open meetings with the Sherpas, with the members of the panel. We did policy briefings much before Planet Under Pressure conference. It was during the process of preparing this major conference that we did all the influencing of Rio plus 20 through another source. So I think that it's very important that this program understands who is taking the decision, when is that decision be taken, who are the others that are more near the countries taking the decisions to influence them, and how can we influence them too? And the time. Don't forget the time, because otherwise it's just too late.
Yeah, don't forget the time, because we are closing. The last word of wisdom is going to my boss, so please.
I think the Global Water Systems Project should stick to the word system in its name. This is, from my point of view, the research challenge we have, that we elaborate and understand the interactions and interdependencies we have to deal with. So, therefore, I think there can be a contribution to the SDG debate in a way that the future is not with single determined goals. I think the goals have to build up a part of the complexity we have to deal with. What we do not need from the Global Water Systems project is to continue with the old version of IWRM research. I think there we have to be really clear that this is not an answer to the challenges we face. And my last point is what I come back to the beginning. We are now starting to invent new words in the water community. And if we are now going to put water security as an issue on the table, we will solve nothing, because all the challenges, all the problems we have on the table will remain. Such a debate on water security will be time-consuming and will not contribute to solutions on the ground. And therefore, I think there are clear challenges, there are clear goals for the Global Water Systems project, but I also think the project should be careful not continuing with the old-style research where much money had been spent, and I think enough money had been spent.
Dixit. Okay. As a summary, there are a couple of things we haven't talked about. For instance, capacity development. And everybody knows that one of the big issues, particularly for the developing countries, is to develop capacities, build capacities. Even if we had the money to reach the two water and sanitation-related Millennium Development Goals, the question comes, who would implement those projects? And that was an assessment, what would be the manpower or human resources requirement to do, even if we had the money, to do the necessary projects. And what came out, that alone in Africa, we need to increase human resources in water by 300%, in Southeast Asia by 250%, in Latin America by 50%. So capacity development is really the essence of the project in the next phase, and I hope that will be considered. There are a couple of minor issues we haven't considered either, such as funding, for instance. Somebody asked me the other day, how can we assure a continued funding for flood risk research? My response to that was very simple. Put the Prime Minister's office in the flood zone. Well, the work will continue. The recommendations which will be adopted soon of this major conference will be channeled to the Budapest Water Summit that will be held in October 8, 9, 10, and 11, which is a very high-level meeting of political leaders and scientific leaders. Many of you are invited there as keynote speakers. The recommendations from there on will be channeled into the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal generation process. So you have a very important contribution to make. Last but not least, I think the principal message that we should perhaps spread all over the place, water connects. It doesn't divide. Water connects all our systems, whether you talk about social systems, environmental systems, or economic systems. And the Global Water System Project was a fantastic demonstration of that linkage, which I hope will be continued in the future. So water connects nations and it doesn't divide them. Water ought to be an element in peace building over transboundary water resources management as well. With this, I would like to thank, on behalf of Ute and myself, the wonderful contributions members of the panel made, and I think we owe them a big hand. Thank you. Thank you.